Welcome to Elysium Theatre Company's Durham Shakespeare Festival podcast 2023, recorded with Durham University to mark the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio. We present interviews with some of the leading Shakespearean actors and scholars in the UK. I'm Jake Murray, Artistic Director of Elysium Theatre Company, and with me is theatre historian Daniel Blank. Daniel, thank you for joining us. Thank you for doing this. Let's start just by asking you where you first discovered your interest in Elizabethan history and theatre.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jake. This is really fun. I first became interested in Elizabethan history, Elizabethan theatre, and particularly Shakespeare as an undergraduate. I was a student at Columbia, and I was doing Shakespeare plays kind of as just a hobby, as a pastime. But after I had either acted in or directed about a dozen different productions, I realized that this was really my passion and this was what I wanted to pursue. And that shapes my scholarly work even now. My first book, which just came out a couple of months ago, is about the relationship between Shakespeare and student theater in the 16th and 17th centuries. So it's really been, for me, almost always coming at it from a performance angle, even as I'm delving pretty deep into the theater history material.
It's fascinating to think, and it's easy to forget, that there was a thriving student population back then as well. Student theatre and the student life existed hundreds of years ago, not exactly as it does now, but it certainly was there.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things I've always said about these student theatrical traditions, is that within early modern Oxford and Cambridge, we can really see the origins of our own student performance traditions, which is really quite fascinating, that there is that kind of continuity, even though institutions are, in many ways, thankfully, very different from the way they were back then. But they were very rich and very vibrant theatrical traditions that existed in these academic institutions. And very few people have taken the time to look at these plays. And there are a number of reasons for that. But one of the things I've tried to do is kind of bring them back into the conversation and see how they can change our understanding of Shakespeare and his contemporaries.
My understanding is that the student population were very keen on Ben Jonson's works. Is that correct?
Well, actually, they were quite keen on Shakespeare's works. And one of the things that I've discovered in the course of my research is that Shakespeare seems to have had a more or less, I don't want to use that word exceptional. We can, we always want to be wary of that kind of Shakespearean exceptionalism. But he does seem to have had a very close relationship with the university performance cultures. And there are several instances of them either referencing him and his plays in their work, or actually, in one instance in the early 17th century, they actually rewrite. Some students at St. John's College, Oxford, actually rewrite a portion of Midsummer Night's Dream. They take the Pyramus and Thisbe episode and they say, well, this is pretty great. What if we rewrote this with a different episode from Ovid's Metamorphoses? And they produce a play called Narcissus, which is really more Shakespearean than it is Ovidian. So, Johnson has a close relationship with the universities. That is something I talk about in my book. And he actually spends time at Oxford in 1619. He's invited to come here as a kind of poet or playwright in residence. What's a little bit more surprising is that we can see Shakespeare as a part of this connection as well.
Yes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Love's Labour's Lost deals with students, doesn't it? Aren't they scholars, the men, who take a vow of celibacy as they devote themselves to learning?
Absolutely. And one of the things I argue is that play derives ultimately from the kinds of satirical traditions that we see happening, particularly in Cambridge, in the late 1570s and early 1580s. And you can kind of draw a straight line from what's happening in those academic environments to the kind of satire that Shakespeare is producing in showing a group of scholars who, as you say, take these vows, take these oaths to be a certain kind of institutional inhabitant, a certain kind of member of the academy.
It's fascinating because in a lot of our other podcasts, we've talked a lot about the makeup of Shakespeare's audience. We've talked about the huge preponderance of the ordinary people, the groundlings who stood.
Absolutely.
Merchants and the aristocrats, and then ultimately the monarchy. But we haven't talked about the student population. And yet again, it's a sign of how universal the work was and how the different forms of theatre and art and everything, literature, were porous. They reached all the different kind of, there's a very organic connection to Elizabethan society at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the remarkable things about his plays is the way that they appeal to different sectors of society. And I think that's true today as it was back then. I mean, we can think about something too like Hamlet, right? Arguably Shakespeare's most famous play. The very first edition of Hamlet that's printed in 1603. This is an edition that we call the First Quarto. It actually says on its title page that it was performed at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. Now, we don't know if that's true. We don't have the archival evidence to substantiate that claim. But what we can say with some certainty is that somebody, whether it was Shakespeare himself, whether it was the person publishing this edition, or somebody in between, somebody thinks that the text of this play, which, by the way, is about a university student, somebody thinks that this is going to hold a great amount of appeal. So we don't know if that's, a marketing tool or if it's a genuine reflection of the fact that the play was taken there and performed. But what we can say is that this notion that Shakespeare's plays are meant to be either lowbrow or highbrow or middlebrow or something like that, I think it kind of detracts from the way that these plays do have a kind of universalizing appeal.
Might call them multi-brow.
Well, yeah, I like that. And I think, I always say to my students, this idea that Shakespeare was universal, this idea that his plays appeal to every single person in the world across time and across space, is something that develops in the centuries after his death. And I think it's something that we can rightfully push back on a little bit. And we can say, is this really the concept that we should have of these plays? But certainly within Elizabethan and Jacobean society, I think one of the things his plays do remarkably well is to appeal to people just across the society. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my book is to show how that exchange with the academic environment gives us a totally new dimension, especially since at that point, Shakespeare himself is considered by those people there the kind of lowbrow entertainment. Shakespeare and his contemporaries are technically prohibited from performing within university precincts, and yet we can see him in his works really infiltrating these environments in very exciting and very productive ways.
That's absolutely fascinating. And of course, as you say, and we've discussed elsewhere, that at the time, theatre was seen as this, as you say, lowbrow entertainment. It wasn't classically, they didn't see it as classically based in the way that poetry was, epic poetry, lyric poetry, pastoral poetry. It was a new form. But as you're saying, it was already infiltrating into all levels of society at the time. But it didn't explode fully formed, did it? It grew out of Shakespeare's theatre, It grew out of a theatrical environment that was already evolving in London. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. In the mid-1570s, you start to see the real proliferation of public playhouses in London, as well as professional playing companies. There's an attempt in the late 1560s to build a professional playhouse, but it's not really until the establishment of a venue called, fittingly enough, the Theatre, in the mid-1570s that these permanent establishments really become fixtures of the London theatre scene. And a lot more spring up in the years that follow. There's one called the Curtain, another one called the Rose in the late 1580s. That's one of the venues we think Shakespeare's earliest plays were probably performed. The Swan and the Globe, and of course a few more. So this really is taking off as an activity in the years leading up to when Shakespeare is going to join that theatrical scene. And Shakespeare is one among many working playwrights in early modern London at this moment. That's always important to keep in mind. Again, we have this notion of Shakespeare as kind of the playwright, but he's just one amongst many. Some of these others were part of a group that we now know as the University Wits. These included Christopher Marlowe, Robert Greene, John Lilly, and a few others. And these guys graduate from Oxford and Cambridge, and then they go on to London to pursue careers as writers and playwrights. But of course, Shakespeare didn't have a university degree, which makes him something of an outsider. And that's a really interesting dynamic. And it's important too, and this is kind of coming to the subject of my own research, it's important to remember that there are many different sites of dramatic activity in the early modern period. When we talk about the Shakespearean stage, we're usually referring to London, and that is in many ways the epicenter. But there are also performances happening at schools, at universities, as I've said, and at the Inns of Court, and of course in these locations across England by traveling players and also acting troupes that have, for one reason or another, gone on tour. So it's this really rich and really varied theatrical scene into which Shakespeare is coming at the end of the 1580s and early 1590s, first as an actor and then as a playwright.
And presumably, as with any kind of period of great kind of ferment in playwriting, he will have seen all these other playwrights' works and possibly even interacted with them. Would you say that was a reasonable assumption?
Absolutely. I think he's highly aware of them. And I also think that he's learning from them. He's learning their craft. He's learning to do what they do, but he's also always observing what he can do better to some extent. And from the perspective of my particular research area, I think he's learning a lot from guys like Marlowe and Greene about the kinds of university theatrical traditions which he might not necessarily have had access to at that point firsthand, right? So there's this kind of secondhand absorption of university dramatic culture, which I do think is very important for him in his early years.
Presumably an element of that is, one of the things in Marlowe is it's riven with the most brilliant references to classical mythology and philosophy and other ideas. Presumably was a result in part of Marlowe's university education. Shakespeare, of course, does the same and goes even further. I'd love to talk a little bit more about his relationship with Marlowe, because in many ways, were they not direct contemporaries? I'm not sure they were even the same age, but there does feel like there's a dialogue between their plays. Edward II, Richard II, The Jew of Malta, Merchant of Venice. How close do we think their working or otherwise personal friendship relationship might have been?
It's hard to know with any certainty. I think they certainly knew each other. They certainly knew each other's works. They're what we might call near contemporaries in that their careers overlap, but only just. Marlowe's career comes to an abrupt end as Shakespeare's is beginning to take off. And you talk about the correspondences between their plays, and I think those are absolutely there. And I would add to that mix Hamlet and Dr. Faustus. The fact that both of these plays are about scholars at Wittenberg, right? So I think, Hamlet is, of course, a very rich and complex tapestry, but one of the threads that we can pursue is this play by his very prominent predecessor, Christopher Marlowe. So yeah, I think there's all kinds of correspondence there. And we now also know that this theater scene was collaborative to some degree. Now, scholars are still debating just how collaborative, right? But some want to claim, and there may be a lot of merit to this, that Marlowe and Shakespeare were in certain instances co-authors. And so, again, as I say, the jury is still out, and how we determine these kinds of things is very complicated. And you can maybe never do so with 100% certainty. But in terms of, would they have known each other? Sure. Would they have known each other's work? Sure. And I think Marlowe is a very important influence on Shakespeare's early career.
Yeah, it's that classic thing. It's, as I say, if you look at any great period of literature, say, for instance, it was almost certain that Noel Coward would have known we know he knew Terence Rattigan. We knew that they all knew John Osborne. They were aware of each other. Harold Pinter knew them all. If you were all working in the same place, and the theatre world, I know from experience, is quite an incestuous place in that respect, you couldn't help but know about each other's work. And you were often competitors as well as friends, and you admired each other's work, but you also, as you say, wanted to do better, because box office was quite important. One of my pet theories, and this is purely a silly theory of my own, is that when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, it's the one of the shows that I've directed, that Mercutio was in some way a tribute to Marlowe. Because if you look at the arc of the character, it's the overreacher, it's the inspired, fiery figure who is killed in a brawl halfway through the play. And I've often felt that that was in some way a kind of epitaph from Shakespeare for Marlowe, in that particularly the great line about the soul that would aspire the stars. I can't remember what the line is when Benvolio comes in and describes the death of Mercutio. But that's just a pet theory. I'm not going to go any further on that. But I like the idea that they must have known each other and they must have been inspired by each other. Fascinated by the idea that perhaps they co-authored. And I've always felt there's a link between, although there's many years between them, Faustus and Prospero, two wizards, two maguses, one a necromancer, the other one not a necromancer, written at very different times in the Renaissance. It always feels that there's some kind of, for me, interesting echo there.
Yeah, and especially if we think about the kind of shape of Shakespeare's career with, Faustus kind of coming nearish the beginning of when we think Shakespeare was starting out, and Prospero coming there at the end, often seen as this kind of Shakespeare figure, relinquishing his literary powers, his magical powers, right there at the end. I think that's very compelling. I think that's very interesting. I mean, I'm also intrigued by your theory about Mercutio in the sense that, you coming at these things from a theatrical angle. As a theater historian, those kinds of things are harder to confirm, right? Well, was Mercutio a reference, right? Would the audience have understood it that way? Those can be very difficult roads to pursue. But in the theater, we can bring in modern theater, I imagine those are the kinds of things that you can accentuate and highlight, and maybe even bring out a certain reference for your audience.
Well, there's certainly a kind of spark there, I think. Tell us a little bit about the structure of Shakespeare's company, because it was very much an ensemble and a professional company, wasn't it? How did that work? And he knew the actors that he was writing before. Tell us a little bit about how the structures of companies worked in those days.
Well, for a writer like Shakespeare, or with the other major professional playing companies in early modern England, as you say, you would get to know your actors, right? Over many years, you probably begin to design parts for specific members of your troupe, rather than finding members of your troupe to take parts, right? So the economy kind of shifts in that way. And there are these prominent members of Shakespeare's troupe about whom we know a bit more than some of the others, right? You have the Richard Burbage, the great tragedian. On the other hand, you have Will Kemp, this great comedian. So you can see these guys who are sort of taking the big parts, taking the big roles. And because of the way these company structures operate, you can see that the parts over time are being shaped in some sense for them, or so we think. They would have had a lot of different plays in their repertory at any given time. So these companies were not performing the same play over and over again, night after night. That's a bit of a distinction from what we usually do today. They would have, plenty of plays ready to go at any given time, and they would vary them based on audience tastes, based on location, if they were traveling. So the variety was kind of key. And knowing that you had actors within your ensemble who could step up to the plate, as it were, and play these parts night after night was absolutely crucial for a writer like Shakespeare.
I think you're absolutely right. And again, speaking from the professional, the theatre world, the world that we now have where you audition your company is a fairly recent one. That most of the great companies in the past were collectives or ensembles. And quite often the greatest playwrights that emerged, everyone from Brecht, Chekhov, Shakespeare, Molière, had their standing company of actors. And when you work with playwrights, particularly if a playwright has written a part with an actor in mind, it's very, very, very easy to understand how Shakespeare could have very quickly started to tailor his shows to the actors, get excited by an actor's possibility, want to stretch them, want to do something new, or even give them a small part because they were busy doing something else in one show and then a big part in the next one because they didn't have anything big in, you know what I mean? And I think one of the things that sets Shakespeare apart is this: every play is a world. Every play is, whether it's Verona or it's ancient Rome or it's Athens or it's medieval England, he creates a completely organic society with all the characters and interacting with each other and pulling at each other. And I don't think you can do that unless you're aware of how an ensemble works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I mean, I think it's true nowadays. We might think of analogous setup across other media as well, right? In film, the way we have certain screenwriters or directors someone like Wes Anderson comes to mind, right? Working often with similar casts. And you can get the sense that, in their later work, as their work developed, we can sort of see how specific parts were probably designed for specific people, as opposed to Shakespeare in his early years, right? Saying, well, who's going to play this part in Titus Andronicus, right? Who can I get to play this part in Comedy of Errors? As opposed to a kind of seasoned Richard Burbage, whom he knows he can count on for a part like King Lear.
Absolutely. So how did theatre practice change over the period that we're talking about? Because as I discussed in another one of the podcasts, obviously the monarch changes midway through Shakespeare's career. And we're talking about, a good few decades of Shakespeare writing and responding to taste. Can you give us a rough, obviously it's a huge subject, but can you give us some broad strokes as to how taste changed, how Shakespeare's work changed, how the experience of theatre changed, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to talk, first of all, about the kind of change that's going on in Shakespeare's theatre from what precedes it, in terms of what's coming before the early modern period. And, what I like to talk about a little bit is there's this emphasis on realism in Shakespeare's theatre. There's this emphasis on the development of characters who aren't one-dimensional, but much more fully brought to life, and their emotions much more fully realized, as opposed to the kind of medieval mystery and morality plays that were much more representational, much more allegorical, right? So I think one of the things that we see happening as this secular drama takes shape in the years that Shakespeare is writing, and even in the decades that follow, is that becomes even more developed, right? That the emphasis on character, the emphasis on realism, is the kind of shift that we're getting as we approach the middle of the 17th century and the outbreak of Civil War, when the theaters are closed and the Shakespearean stage is abruptly halted. So I think that's one of the big shifts. And the other thing that we're seeing with Shakespeare is that he's incredibly good, probably incomparably good, at taking old stories and bringing them to life, right? He works with stories from classical antiquity. As I said, I referenced earlier Ovid's Metamorphoses. That's a real favorite of Shakespeare. We know that Virgil, Plutarch, he takes his stories often from the ancient world, also from medieval literature, from Chaucer and elsewhere. But also, in addition to that, he's also working from more recent efforts. King Lear, a play that has come up a couple of times, that was based on a very recent play called King Lear, Leir, which actually survives. That's printed in 1605, and Shakespeare's play is first printed in 1606. That's not a coincidence. Hamlet, as well, may have been based on an earlier text, which we know only, we call it the Hamlet, but it doesn't survive. So we have to kind of conjecture about what exactly Shakespeare took from it, what is, we might say, quote unquote, original within Shakespeare's, and what is borrowed from someone else. So that's very common practice within this theatrical scene. And I would also say, you mentioned the various, I think you mentioned the monarchs, didn't you, Jake?
Yeah, the transition between Elizabeth I and James I.
So Shakespeare seems to have had, on the whole, an excellent relationship with the royal court, including in the earlier part of his career with Queen Elizabeth I, who was known as a patron of the arts. For instance, in 1597, Shakespeare's play Love's Labour's Lost had its first performance before Elizabeth at court during the Christmas season. And there are many more instances like this. It was also uncommon for noblemen and noble women to go to the playhouses. So there are these known instances when Shakespeare's plays were performed for those audiences at estates and country houses. But it's after King James comes to the throne in 1603, 1604, that Shakespeare's relationship with the monarchy and his acting company's relationship with the monarchy really takes shape. They gain royal patronage, and they go from being the Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men. They even participate in the coronation ceremony in 1604. And after that, they're performing for James and his royal court with some frequency. So the significance of this isn't just from a historical angle, it's also from a literary angle, because we think that certain plays were probably shaped with James himself specifically in mind. For instance, Macbeth derives from a story about the Scottish line of kings from which James supposedly hailed. So we can't underestimate the importance of these kinds of networks, and that's a kind of very rough and broad overview of how Shakespeare's career changes, but also how the theater scene itself is shifting during the 20 years or so that he's writing for the London stage.
It is astonishing to think that it was only 20 years, that the volume of work that he brought out in that time, many of which are exceptional, and even the not the best ones are still pretty good, is a fairly astonishing achievement.
I would just add to that, these are the plays that we know of. It's possible that Shakespeare wrote even more plays. There's this lost play that may have been written by Shakespeare together with his contemporary John Fletcher called Cardenio. And there's also some possibility that there was a sequel, Love's Labour's Lost, called Love's Labour's Won. That play, as you know, ends rather suddenly, and it really seems like there might have been more to it. So I agree with you. It's this astonishing body of work, and it might have even been larger.
Fascinatingly, in our podcast, we're discussing the folio itself. The revelation for me after 30 years of directing in the theatre, that without the First Folio, we might have lost 18 of Shakespeare's scripts, including Macbeth, which would have been an astonishing fail, as it were. Not quite as bad as the amount of Greek drama that was lost in Alexandria, but still pretty bad.
Absolutely.
You've given us an amazing overview of the history, the practice, the relationship between the students and the monarchs. Tell us a little bit more about the general audience that made up his theatre, because of course it was very tiered, wasn't it? But it was a broad cross-section of society that came to see his work.
Yes, I mean, the playhouses were literally and figuratively multi-tiered, and these structures were almost always open air in the Elizabethan period. So there were lots of different seating or standing options. As you mentioned earlier, you could stand in front of the stage quite literally on the ground, hence the name groundlings. And of course, you can still do this at the reconstructed Globe Theatre in London, which is a pretty good replica of the one built by Shakespeare's troupe in 1599. So a groundling ticket was the cheapest option. You could do this for 1 pence, a single penny. But you could also pay more money to be seated in the galleries, which had a better view and more comfortable seating. And there's also this real see and be seen phenomenon. Elizabethan society, Jacobean society, these class hierarchies were so rigid that a lot of it was about sitting up in a gallery, not just so that you had a better view of the stage, but also so that the other people in the theater would have a better view of you, ridiculous as that might sound. And just in terms of the experience of going to the theater in Shakespeare's day, it can be difficult to reconstruct that from a theater historical perspective, right? We always want to be able to find the notebook or the diary of a theater goer that says, today I went to the Globe Theater and here was my exact experience. That's the kind of dream that I wake up to every day. But to whatever extent we can sort of imagine it, this would have been a very vibrant environment, a very exciting atmosphere, and possibly even a rowdy one. These were not controlled experiences. These were not emotional experiences. In a lot of ways, it's not what we think about when we think of the theater today. This notion we have that the curtain rises, we sit in darkness, and everyone is quiet as we watch the actors on stage. This was a much more immersive and interactive experience. And because these were open-air theaters, they were also subject to the elements in ways that most theatrical performances these days are not. And, the other thing to keep in mind, just in terms of the audience experience, is that it would have been a lot less comfortable than today's theaters, especially for those who were standing. Hamlet, for instance, one of the versions that we have, probably the most authoritative version, is roughly 4,000 lines long, right? So if we go by the old rule of thumb of 1,000 lines per hour, that's 4 hours to be standing watching this play in the open air. And this is before the days when intermissions, this is before the days when intervals have really been invented. So it was a much different experience than the ones we usually have today. And at the same time, this kind of immersive, interactive quality of it, I think really that's where we can attribute some of Shakespeare's popularity. I think he is remarkably good at engaging his audience and getting them involved and making them not only interested in, but also feel a part of what's happening on stage.
And part of that is to do with the fact that his plays often create a complete panorama of the society of his time, and also as you say, the class structure and the makeup of the audience, and from the mechanicals to the soldiers before Agincourt, to the shepherds in Winter's Tale. You have the people who would have stood and watched, and then you have the aristocrats, the kings. Everybody was represented on the stage who was actually watching the show. An interesting piece of trivia was that it was actually Wagner who began the process of silence in our performing, and that gradually spread. And it was interestingly Noel Coward who abolished the process of having a curtain call after each act. It was in his production of his only tragedy, really, a very powerful play, The Vortex. He cancelled the idea of an interval and a curtain call between each act because he wanted the whole thing to move much, much more quickly. He still had an interval because selling drinks was a fairly important way in which theatres stay open. But the way we now watch theatre now is very, very different to how it was. So even 100 years ago, one of the reasons why things like Chekhov or Wilde have multiple locations, and each time the curtain comes up, you would have had a very elaborate set, was they would have 15 minutes between each interval, or maybe even half an hour, where the whole set revamped, and you then came out and suddenly you were in the cherry orchard, and then the next thing you were back in the house. So everything has changed, and the way we understand theatre now is very different. And what's interesting about what you say is aware of how hard it is as a director with a production of a play like a Shakespeare, of making an audience that's sitting in an environment where they're silent, they're comfortable, and they're expected to concentrate is hard enough. The idea that those actors had to go out and silence the crowd and grip them from the beginning and take them through big extrovert moments like battles and ghosts and witches, but also very intimate moments like Hamlet's soliloquies or Desdemona's death. Do you know what I mean? Those moments, that the power of the actor and what the actor must have had to do in those days to make that happen is a real testimony, not just to the audience's stamina, but also to what the actors are able to do in terms of commanding the power of the audience.
I think that's right. And I mean, that sort of ability to modulate the tone of the performance it requires incredible skill, especially in Shakespeare's plays. And anyone who's ever done outdoor theater, and I count myself amongst that number. As an undergraduate, we had a tradition of doing an outdoor Shakespeare play every spring. You know that it is so difficult because it's harder to account for all of the variables, right? When an airplane flies overhead, which of course wasn't happening in Shakespeare's day, but whatever the equivalent was, you have to be able to handle that moment and keep the audience's attention. Now, it's worth saying too, it's worth saying a couple of things. One of them is that not all plays being performed in Shakespeare's day were successful in that, right? There are plenty of plays that are performed by some of Shakespeare's contemporaries that we think were only performed once, right? That did not work on the stage, that were booed or hissed. Elizabethan and Jacobean theater goers were not hesitant to express their disapproval if they did not like something in a play. And whether that led to a play being revised or rewritten, or whether that led to a play being scrapped altogether would have varied. But I think that's important to remember when we talk about a theatrical culture where not every play was a hit, right? Not every play was a success. And just the second thing that I'll say is, of course, in the later part of Shakespeare's career is when the indoor theaters start to become more of a phenomenon, especially with the Black Friars, which opens at the beginning in the first decade of the 17th century, where some of Shakespeare's later plays, particularly the late romances, are thought to have been performed. And this changes things to be doing it inside. It changes things in terms of those variables that you have to control for. We also think those theaters, although you don't have the street noise, or you're not subject to rain or the elements, people smoked within them, right? So they were quite hazy. You also had to pause the performance to cut the candles, to relight the candles. So these kinds of breaks in performance start to become much more common in the later part of Shakespeare's career. And that's a fairly significant shift. And perhaps one of the reasons that some of his later plays have these kinds of more natural breaks. In The Winter's Tale, something like that, we can feel a sort of caesura in the middle of that play, which would have been not just advantageous to the attention of the spectators, the kind of attention span of the spectators, but which also would have allowed for various practicalities to take place.
But that's riveting, because The Winter's Tale was the first Shakespeare I ever directed, and it's famously tricky because of that split in the play between the first 3 acts and the second 2. But what you've just said is a complete revelation of a brilliant example of a writer using a challenge to their advantage of saying, well, we have to stop here and do the candles. So we will stop here and do the candles. And within that period, we'll fast forward for 16 years. As a director and as a writer, dealing with your limitations and making it look as if they're not limitations, but they're artistic decisions is one of the most fun things that you have to do. Daniel, I have to say, this has been an absolutely fascinating and engaging conversation. And you've, again, as with so many of these conversations, illuminated me. I've been working in the theatre for 30 years. I think I know Shakespeare. I thought I know Shakespeare. I certainly knew some of the things that you said, but so much of what you said has enriched my appreciation of him and the work that he did and brought him to life even more. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to you for that. Before we go, where can we go to find out more about the world of his time and the theatre of his time?
Well, a good place to start, there's a book called The Shakespearean Stage by a theatre historian called Andrew Gurr. That's a real canonical resource. More recently, Tiffany Stern's work, Making Shakespeare, is a great book for those who would look to learn more about the kinds of mechanics of how everything worked in Shakespeare's day. I would recommend those two books as starting places. And people can always get in touch with me if they're interested in learning more, I would say. This conversation has been an absolute joy for me as well. And one of the reasons I think it's been so productive is that, we've been talking about the kinds of bridges that exist between the printed texts as we have them on the page and also how they function as plays on the theatrical stage. And I think that, too often those things get separated. But as I said at the beginning, I came at this originally from a performance perspective. So being able to have this conversation with you and talk about the kind of work you're doing has been really fun.
Me too. Daniel Blank, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jake.
That was Daniel Blank sharing with us his knowledge of Shakespeare and his theatre. To find out more about the Durham Shakespeare Festival 2023, go to our website www.elysiumtc.co.uk.